G'day, this is Expand the Phantom podcast. Our website is chroniclechamber.com and you can subscribe to our podcast via YouTube or through your favourite podcast apps. Please give us a rating, which will help other fanatics find us. Welcome to episode 274, where we talk to Andreas Eriksson, the writer. Andreas is one of those lucky few fans who gets paid to work on the Phantom. Now, we have chatted with Andreas a few times on the podcast. In episode 14, he talked to us about the history of the Phantom in Sweden. That was all the way back in 2014, 10 years ago. Can you believe that? We've been doing this for 10 years. That's scary. Episode 201 to 2021, which is where he chatted with us about his role as an editor, but also as a fan. And in episode 243, which was last year, he gave us a preview of what's to come in Fantomen 23. G'day, Andreas. How are you?
I'm fine. Always a bit busy, but that's how life is right now.
Yeah. You would have thought that COVID would have taught us to settle down, and but it's like we've got to catch up on on those years that we lost.
Yeah.
Now, we are planning on having a podcast soon to chat about what is to come for Fantomen 2024. Hopefully it's soon, otherwise it will turn into what's to come for 2025. But the other Phantom hat you wear, besides a fan and as an editor, is a writer of Phantom stories as well. Now, at this stage of recording, which is towards the end of February, this podcast will be coming out at the end of February 2024, you have written and had 6 stories published around the world. Now, they are The Blood Rain, The True Singh Brotherhood, which were all first published in Fantomen. Then you've had one for Lightning Strikes, which is the final chapter. And then for Frew, you've had Femme Fatale, The Links in the Chain, and The Singh Raiders. As we go later on in the podcast, we will in greater detail go over these stories because there's a few things we want to discuss and stuff like that. But first of all, we got some generic questions that we want to ask you as a writer. Now, we've talked to you as a fan, we've talked to you as an editor. This is about you as a fan. As a writer, sorry. So I guess the first question is which story did you actually write first?
The first story that was actually written was Femme Fatale. And it has been an idea of mine since I looked through some old files and I found my first notes about it. They were from about 2006. That's when I started to get the idea for the story. And then a couple of years later, I had written it down to a synopsis or a summary of the whole story. I submitted it to Egmont. This was while Ulf Granberg was still the editor of Egmont's Team Fantomen production. He was going to look at it, but I heard nothing back, and then he retired. So then I submitted it to Hans Lindahl and Claes Reimerty. They took over the editorship of the new production of stories after Ulf. And Claes replied that it's not the kind of story they were looking for. They were trying to make more stories where the Phantom is like the main character, the focus of the story. And this one is more, well, the Phantom is a supporting character, I would say. So they were trying to change the direction a little bit, and my idea didn't fit at that time.
So we're talking about what, 2013, 2014, 2015?
Yep. And then a couple of years after that, Mikael Sol, he had already taken over the editorship of the magazine. And a couple of years later, he also took over the production of the new stories. So I thought, here's an opportunity. So I sent the same story to him. And I don't think he replied. I don't remember that he did anyway. So a couple of years later, Frew begins to produce their own stories. And one more time, I send the story to Glenn Ford. And he liked it, commissioned me to write the script. And that's the first script that I finished. It still wasn't the first story that was published, but it was the first story that I finished. And it took a long time just to get the script down. And then we can talk more about that later, but it took several years after that for actually the story to be drawn and published.
Yeah, wow. So okay, so you wrote the plot and the synopsis and all that type of stuff pretty much 10 years before, close to 10 years before it actually became
Well,
published.
more than 10 years before it was published.
Yeah.
About 10 years before it was accepted into becoming a script. I did some tweaks between the different times I sent it in, but mainly it was a question of timing, I think, to
Yeah.
find the right time for a story like this more than anything else.
So the the person who likes to have an argument with, which, in me, would question Clace's decision because that was around the time when they created all those gladiator stories and the Egyptian
Mm.
pharaoh phantom stories. That doesn't feature the Phantom at all, but he wanted the Phantom
Well,
as the main character.
no, well, true, but they were steering a bit away from that at that
Mm,
time.
okay.
So the Gladiator stories they had begun in 2007, I think. So they were sort of wrapping it
All
up
right.
by then, and then they were steering the production towards more stories where it's really the Phantom who is really the main character, not I actually liked those stories where it's like a bigger world of the Phantom, and it isn't necessarily the Phantom himself who is the main character, but it's stories from his world. That's what I liked, and that kind of inspired me. But then my story idea didn't fit when they were trying to steer away a bit from that.
Mm. It's interesting because, oh, we won't dwell too much on it, but you've also got the Phantom's World short stories that Fantomen created, what, 5, 8 years ago, which
Yeah.
have got backup stories. Yeah, what, anywhere between, we've seen some in through, they're what,
Mm,
2 to 8 pages, and they're about, Garan taking a bath
mm.
with in the jungle with Jumba, or there's the Panther Queen, and so these are all backup type of characters. So
Yeah. So and again, that happened after
mm,
I got that reply. That was when Mikael Sol took over the production, and he was definitely more open to other ideas. But I don't know why. I mean, it's always difficult to find a slot to get a story accepted for many reasons. It's also the fact that there are fewer stories being produced,
yeah.
at least for Egmont. And then Frew came along, and then you had another options. That's why I
Mm,
switched focus to Frew for a bit. But yeah, it wasn't the end of my attempts with Egmont. So as you know, I came back to writing for Egmont, and my first published stories, they were made for Egmont instead.
So your first published story, from what I understand, is Blood Rain,
Yes, that's right.
and then the next one was the final chapter, which was for Lightning Strikes.
True. Yep.
And then you've got the True Sing Brotherhood, which was 2021.
Yeah.
And then, yeah,
Yeah.
Femme Fatale, The Links in the Chain, and then the Sing Raiders. So
And
do you have any other stories that are currently being created?
I
Or
have one more script that was accepted by Frew several
okay.
years ago. The Frew and Egmont have a bit of a different approach. As Egmont, they review story ideas submissions like once a year, and then they make a plan for the upcoming year. Order the scripts and the artwork for stories that are going to be published in the upcoming year, and even designate them to a specific issue. And usually that's how it unfolds. Whereas Frew commissions a script, it can take time before anyone starts drawing it. It can take a long time before it's finished, and when it's finished, they schedule it for publication. So in the case of Egmont, you may have noticed that sometimes there have been a switch in artists mid-story or something like that. Sometimes an artist has been switched out even before they have started to draw the story, because the story has a specific deadline and a specific issue. So if an artist can't be on time, they have to call in a backup artist to help speed it up or something like that, to be on time for that issue. Otherwise, we have to bring in an unscheduled reprint or something like that.
Now,
Yeah,
in the comic industry, dealing with creatives that aren't always working to schedule, that must get quite frustrating. But we're not here to talk about you as an editor. We're here to talk about you as one of those flaky creators. Andreas, how do you work as a writer? Do you get an idea and then flesh it out with the plot, and then it goes into the full script with lots of references for the artists and really help them? Or are you more like Lee Falk and Stan Lee, where you provide them minimal scripts and then take all the glory?
Well, first of all, I do get a lot of random ideas, and most of my ideas are inspired by reading other Phantom stories. Like I can get ideas about, well, what would this character do in that situation, or what would happen if the Phantom met this kind of people. So I would say most of my story ideas, they can only work as Phantom stories because they are so much part of the Phantom world. It's not like a random crime story that you could just switch out the main character and it will work. And usually I can get a few key scenes in my head that I start working on almost like in the back of my head until I start writing it down, bouncing some dialogue back and forth to see that this scene actually works because it's, you know, some an important scene for the story. And if I feel that those scenes work, then I will start to write a synopsis. A synopsis is less detailed. It doesn't include dialogue that I just wrote, but I write it so I know that, you know, it feels like I can develop it into a story later. Then I write a synopsis, which is like a summary of the entire story. And this is not that detailed at all. It can be 1 or 2 pages, something like that. And that is then submitted to whichever editor or publisher that I want to try submitting it to. And it's up to them to approve it or not. And this is the process for all writers these days, I would think. If it's approved, it goes on to the scripting stage. And I think that everyone today scripts basically the same way, which is a detailed full script where you have descriptions for each and every panel, instructions for the artists, what to draw, and the dialogue that is supposed to be seen in that panel and so forth. And I've seen of Lee Falk's scripts. They were also full script in the sense that they described panel by panel and had the dialogue. They could have been sparse in the descriptions, but they were the full script type. I don't think that, well, maybe some of the American comic book stories could have been made like the Marvel method, where there's only a very basic plot given to the artist, and the artist creates most of the story, and then it goes back to the writer that adds the dialogue after they see the artwork. I think that very few Phantom stories have ever been made that way, and definitely not these days. Especially since, yeah.
I was going to say, I know the Defenders of the Earth comic book series was created using the Marvel method.
Yeah, which makes sense since it was a Marvel production.
So do you provide the artists with references?
Also, yes, I will have a lot of references for the artists. I almost feel like apologizing when I write the script to them, because I have both a lot of descriptions on what to show in the panel, and I often have references to past characters or stories or something like that. So I will include like a reference file of images for them to look at also. A lot of artists want their freedom to create their own stuff, but that's not exactly how I work. So I'm sorry for that, all artists. But one interesting thing that I have noticed, when we work on the Phantom, we don't know who the artist is going to be. So that's also one reason for writing very detailed scripts, because I don't know how much knowledge the artist will have. And there is a school here in the town where I live where they have an education for comic book artists. So you can actually go to school here and get trained on how to work in the comic book field as an artist. and I have been associated with that. And I go in and have a couple of guest lectures with every new class. Among other things, I do an exercise where they get a page of script from a Phantom story that I have written. So every student gets 1 page each from a story that is, 22 pages. So they don't do a detailed drawing. They just do a sketch, like a layout and general placing of characters and stuff like that. And then they get to see the final result as it looked when a professional did it in the magazine. And it never comes out the same. Doesn't matter how much I describe, but it always looks a bit different for every person who looks at the script and then translates it to artwork.
Wow.
So it's not detailed in the sense that I describe exactly where everything is going to be, but you have to mention what is going to be important, so nothing is missed that is then going to be important later in the story, and stuff like that. But every artist is going to do it their own page layout, their own angles and stuff like that. So it's never going to look the same anyway.
Interesting. That will be very interesting. Now, when one of the things that we enjoy about your stories that you have written is that you're very detailed. You know the Phantom. We've discussed this. So, are you going to take over the writing duties of the Sandal Singh and the 22nd Phantom saga?
No, I'm not going to do that. But I was involved with Mikael Sol, who was the previous editor when this series started, and Jacob Habins, who is the current project manager with Egmont, who handles the production of new stories. The three of us had a meeting where we went through the storyline so far, all the plot points that were necessary to sort of resolve or continue, and stuff like that. So we had quite a detailed document to supply the writer who was going to do it. And I will feel that I have contributed a lot to that, but it's not in the sense of creating a story. It's more like making sure that we don't miss any important things that happened. I mean, Klaus left us with a lot of open ends to a lot of plot points in that storyline. And as he told me, he didn't have a solution for them all either. That's how he worked, at least in this series, that he created challenges for himself. He threw in a character lurking in the shadows without knowing who that was going to be, and solved that a couple of issues later on, and other plot points like that. And when he retired, he basically just said, "Good luck. I look forward to seeing what's coming next," because he didn't have answers to all these open ends. He just left it like that.
Yeah.
So,
wow.
So we had a meeting where we identified all the important plot points. We have some ideas for a resolution that it also has to work in the context of some other stories and just the Phantom in general. It has to be a Phantom feeling all through. So I will feel that I have contributed a lot to them when they come out, but the actual storyline is going to be written by someone else.
Okay, so I gotta ask, you can say no comment. Who's the writer that's going to be writing the stories?
No comment.
Is it an established writer?
No comment, but I will say that we hope to say more soon. We just don't want to deliver too much before we actually have a bit more of a scheduling for it. I think optimistically we could have a story in this storyline by the end of this year, but
oh wow,
we don't want to promise it. So it could also be next year.
Okay.
But you will just have to wait and see.
I don't like waiting. You should know that, Andreas.
Yeah.
The other question, again, can be a no comment. Does the fatherhood of Sandal's child get solved?
It's definitely one of the points that were discussed and handed over to the new writer.
Okay.
But if and how it will be resolved is something you'll have to wait for.
I'm trying to get something out of you, but it's very hard. have you made a decision, or is the decision entirely up to the new writer?
I think that for several of these open plot points, we made suggestions.
Okay.
Suggestions based on, it has to fit in with other continuity and stuff like that. It has to make sense with that. But they are not, if the writer has a better idea, he is free to suggest it.
Okay.
So it's not carved in stone in that sense, but we also have to narrow it down, not just within the context of these stories that Klaus wrote in this storyline, but if you bring in characters, if you bring in other characters, you have to make sure that they appear logically in the story and stuff like that. So we gave a pretty detailed document to the writer to look at, but we are open to suggestions.
Okay. All right. Last question on this, and then we'll move on.
Mm-hmm.
If you were writing the story, would you make the child the Phantoms or someone else's? And I don't want a no comment. I want a yes or no answer.
I don't think I have a good answer on that, actually. I'll have to pass on that. I don't have a good answer.
Okay, moving on.
Yeah.
What's your greatest influence when it comes to Phantom stories? Either as a writer or as a fan. Is it a certain writer? Is it a certain era? Like when you're rereading Phantom stories or working with your editor's hat or as your fan, what gives you your greatest influence?
Well, I grew up reading the Swedish magazine stories from the 1970s and 80s and early 90s, of course, also. They formed my view of the Phantom, and that was creators like Norman Walker and Don Avenell, Claes Reimerty, of course, Ulf Granberg, both as a writer and editor, Dai Darell and Idi Carelli and Hans Lindahl as a writer and an artist, of course. They were among my favorites. Lee Falk was a bit of an acquired taste. I actually didn't really get how good he was until I started reading the Frew issues. When I started trading with other Phantom collectors and I got the Frew issues with the complete and unedited stories, also a lot of the older stories from the 1930s to 1960s, then I started to see his qualities in a different light, and also understanding how limited he was. When you're a kid growing up reading the comic book, you don't understand why the stories by Lee Falk and Cy Barry always have the same page layout with boring small panels. There are no big splash pages and stuff like that, because you don't understand that these stories were made as daily strips and published in newspapers. So when I finally got to see them unedited and thought in my mind what kind of limitations he must have been working with, I have another kind of appreciation for what he was doing. Also, that he was writing continuously every day, whereas other writers, they can take a break and say, I don't have any inspiration for a year, and just do something else, work on another character or whatever.
Fair enough.
So I think when I write now, I especially feel that my style is sort of connected to Don Avenell, because he also he preferred to write modern Phantom stories, not the historical stories, which require a lot of references and research. And he also had a very strong emotional side to his characters. Dai Darell also, I would say, did the same, where the characters, they were not just emotionless people acting out in an action story. They were characters with emotions, and their emotions affected their decision making, and they could make bad choices and good choices depending on how they felt, and that made the story unfold in a different way. Also, Idi Carelli is someone I think he made a lot of interesting, quirky stories that challenged the way the normal stories were. The majority of the stories were written, but he's a difficult writer to aspire to be. But yeah, I think that I definitely follow more in the footsteps of the writers who focused on the modern stories and characters with a really fleshed out emotional core.
That's good. So, is there one story you would love to write, i.e., the 21st Phantom's death, the 22nd Phantom's swearing of the oath, a sequel or a prequel or a follow-up of a character, but there's that one story in you that's like your holy grail?
I think that everyone who reads the Phantom starts to think about what could happen if the 21st Phantom died, and not just writers. But after having had those initial thoughts some time long ago, I didn't really think back to that again. I think that what I prefer to write are stories that build the world of the Phantom, make the world a bit bigger, give more room for the supporting characters, give them a life of their own, so to speak, and while at the same time connecting with other stories to make it feel that this is a whole world of stories. It isn't just random one-shot stories. It's actually connected, and one story affects the Phantom's life, so that in the next story he is affected by what happened before, and so on, which is a bit difficult in the way that we are working. It's not like in American comic books where you have a writer who he's assigned to write a whole year or several years of a comic, so you can sort of more easily play out a story arc and a development. In our case, when we work on the Phantom, we do one story here, and then the next story is a couple of years later. So I can't just connect it to my last story. I had to see what happened in between and try to connect it with stories by other writers to make that feeling of everything being tied in together. So I think that's noticeable in that I have read a lot of Phantom stories. So these connections, they come to me quite naturally when I start building a story, bringing in different characters. I know what they have done in the past and how that would relate in a new story, and it kind of organically builds a connection with previous stories, even if I didn't write them.
I think that's something where Phantom fans from around the world, especially those who read Fantomen and Frew, we're very lucky at the moment in the sense that we've got the next generation of fans who have now become writers. And I'm talking about yourself, Duncan, Matt Kime, Shane Foley, where Shane Foley's a little bit older, but he'll be happy to be lumped in with the 40-year-olds. But like those people where they've and even to a lesser extent Peter Anderson as well, where they've grown up reading the Phantom, so that knowledge of knowing about all the Lee Falk stories, knowing about all of these old Team Fantomen stories, and they can intertwine those elements in their own stories because they don't need the Phantom Bible or they don't need an editor, so to speak, because they're fans and they know all these characters. They know that that the Wambezi do do crops and the Longo do cattle and the Maori do fish, and they know all that type of stuff. They don't need to be told that. So I think we're very lucky with that at the moment. And I think it's actually, and then when you get, and this is no disrespect, but then when you get other people who don't have that knowledge writing stories, it can feel a little bit not empty, but there's like that backstory that's not quite there. So I think we're very lucky at the moment.
Yeah, and I don't think that you can expect fans to become creators like that. The world of professional comic book writing and drawing is limited, and you have to pick people who are professionals and not just fans.
Yeah.
Like you say, some of us have moved on from being fans to now writing or drawing professionally, but we had to become professionals first, so to speak, to learn how to do it. Like I said, my first story took 10 years to go from idea to being accepted as a script. And between that time, I actually, as I had gotten to know writers and editors at the time, I asked a lot of questions on how they worked, and I got to read a lot of synopsis and scripts before I wrote my own. So I didn't, even though the Phantom was sort of my first published work, it wasn't like I went from a reader to a writer. It was 10 years of studying how to become a comic book writer and how to especially become a Phantom comic book writer and the work procedure for that.
Yeah, no, that's a very good point. So I guess if you're out there and you want to write or draw, don't give up. What's your favorite story you have written so far?
It's actually the Singh Raiders, which is my only historically set story. But I really felt that a lot of nice pieces came together when I wrote that story, and I think I made sense out of Julie acting as the Phantom, which is sometimes difficult. I know some people don't want her to sort of become the Phantom. She was filling in for her brother in one Phantom story by Lee Falk, and some people think it should have been just that. But I think there is a balance where she feels so strongly about justice that she is going to act if her brother is out of the picture, or maybe even if he is there, because she just can't resist. She has the Walker family sense of justice in her. So yeah, and it was really fun to write. A lot of things was added in the scripting stage. I think that happens for all my stories, that I get ideas that I didn't have when I was just writing the basic plot. But especially in the Singh Raiders, I came up with a lot of stuff when I was writing the detailed script that wasn't in the plot synopsis, and that was a lot of fun.
Awesome. I think I've got an idea of some of those, and we'll discuss that when we go through the story. Now, this may be another no comment question, but do you have a favorite artist that you have worked with so far? I know it's like choosing your favorite cat.
Yeah. I'm not gonna say no comment, but I have been very lucky. My first published story for Egmont was the one with 8 different artists doing one part each. So I was just so happy to see all of them working on my script, even if it was just a few pages each. But I mean, that was my only chance to work with all of them, given how few stories are being produced and how few stories are given to each writer, so to speak, and with some of the artists retiring or even passing away since that story was made. So if that story had been done, I wouldn't have worked with all those 8 people. And that was just great. And then I think then I did the when I did the Lightning Strikes story, that's a bit special because Nick, who did that story with me, he's someone I had actually met and become a friend of before that. So that's the only story that I have done where I actually knew who was going to do the story, and we did it like a team, so to speak. And so that was very special. And then I got back to Egmont and Janusz, who wasn't one of the 8 artists on that first story, has drawn one of my Egmont stories, and I think he's the best Egmont artist at the moment. He is a very dynamic and powerful style. I like it a lot. And then Frew found a great artist for my scripts, which was Ivan Rodriguez. I've been in touch with a lot of the Egmont artists, but never while they were working on my story. I mean, that's out of my hands at that point. It's for the editor, in that case, Jacob, to deal with. But I have been in contact with them before, and Nick, who did the Lightning Strike story, I have met and know him. But Ivan, I have had no contact with. I have no idea how he enjoys drawing my stories, or if he thinks they are just too much instructions and too much references. But he does a great job of it, and I think to me he is the artist that is most closely like Hans Lindahl today.
Yeah.
And Hans Lindahl is my number one artist, and he was retired before I started writing, so he will never draw something that I have done. And I think Ivan is the second best when it comes to drawing in that style. So I've been
I was going to say, when I first saw Ivan's work, that's what kind of connected with me is, not a Hans Lindell clone, but he's got that style that I can see.
Yeah. I think Ivan has the most similar style to Hans Lindahl, while Janusz has the same effect as Hans Lindahl. He is sort of redefining what is the modern look of the Phantom. Yeah. Just like his drawing style doesn't look at all like Hans Lindahl, but his influence is the same. That now we can take the Phantom in another direction that is appropriate for this time.
The thing that I like about Jonas Alden's work is it looks just as good in color and just as good in black and white. There's not many artists where it doesn't matter whether they're being published in Fantomen or Frew, where they look equally as good. I remember we did a podcast, and I think one of them, Stephen, made a comment about, his work looks amazing in black and white, and then we brought up the same panel in color, and then he was like, "Oh, it looks even better." No, it looks just as good. And we were having this discussion is whether it's better, whether it's better in color or black and white, and it's a real debate. What does look better from Janus's work? It looks equally just as well. Where a lot of artists, it's like no good in black and white, but good in color, and then in other stuff it's like no, just stick to black and white. So very good. You managed to choose all your artists and not offending any of them, so you did a good job. Have you ever used the Phantom Bible?
I'm aware of it. I have looked at it together with you sometimes, but I think that as a writer my stuff stays within what I already know pretty well, and I'm not exactly challenging any lores or stuff like that. So I haven't used it as a tool for my writing, really.
It's all right. We'll still stay friends. As a fan and as a writer, do you believe in a strict law that creators need to adhere to? And if they are to break it, do they have to then return it back to what it was before, or can they leave it broken?
I think that it's okay that we have different continuities, so to speak. We have the Team Fantomen stories, and we have the newspaper stories, and we have the Frew stories, and we have Moonstone and whatever. And I think it's okay that they do their own thing. It's fine as long as they don't contradict each other. It makes it easier, so to speak, for the reader. But it's absolutely fine to me that Team Fantomen had a different president for a while, or Moonstone had a different leader for the Zinc Pirates and stuff like that. But I do feel that it has to be consistent within that continuity. So that within the Team Fantomen stories, we have to make sure that we don't mess up the timeline with historical stories, the ancestors. We have to make sure that supporting characters and villains and stuff like that, when they come back, it makes sense to what they were doing the last time we saw them and stuff like that. So that's really important to me, that it actually feels like we are building something that is connected and not just standalone stories and then, oops, this happened. It doesn't make sense with that thing that happened 10 years ago, but who cares? I think it's important to care about these pieces of history, so to speak, that for the reader makes it feel like something consistent, coherent. But I think we're at this stage where we don't have to try to make everything feel like it's one big continuity. If Moonstone wants to do their thing, let them do their thing. If Frew wants to do their thing, let them do it. And Team Fantomen and the newspaper stories, of course, go their own route.
So major things like Deaths of Phantoms, Phantoms' Wives, the timeline that each Phantom kind of exists. So you can't have the 12th Phantom in the 1500s, or and then in one universe, and then the 12th Phantom in the 1700s in another one.
I think that it's okay that let's say that the 12th Phantom had a different kind of life and a different wife and experience in the Team Fantomen stories compared to the Moonstone stories. That's fine. But within the Moonstone stories, you can't then create another story about the 12th Phantom that contradicts that one. Then you're breaking your own continuity. So I don't think that it has to be. Between the different continuities, it helps if it feels like it's one and the same comic. But I think that you can have a bit of freedom with details like that. But within the continuity, within the Team Fantomen production, I think it's really important that we try to stay on the same timeline, don't contradict previous stories, try to connect and correct contradictions. So within each continuity, I think it's very important to stick to lore and smaller details also.
Yep, I agree. That's why I created the Phantom Bible. Okay, so in a lot of your stories, you join dots. You bring back several old characters. We've talked about some. In the Cybari's story, you had the missing link. You had the missing link who was dressed up, his future wife. You had Sala. You've got Kate Somerset gets mentioned in your Sing Raiders story. And then in the True Sing Brotherhood story, you've got a throwback bad girl that's appeared in one story, and you've reintroduced her, and so you've got all these references. Do you feel that this gives fans, especially the hardcore fans, the ability to be able to connect and enjoy your stories more?
I think so, but above all, it's more fun for me to write them. But this also brings back memories from when I was a kid, and when I was reading like Marvel comics and DC comics that were published in Sweden. Those were also filled with the references like C issue something back in the past. But the thing was that not all those issues and stories were published in Sweden. So a lot of those references were just this is a reference to a story that has not been published in Sweden. So you couldn't even find it easily in Sweden and read it. But it still gave me the impression of this is a much bigger world or a universe it made the stories more interesting for me to feel that it was part of a bigger whole. And I think that will appeal to some of the readers that read my stories. But at the same time, adding a reference like that or bringing back a character, it's not like a homework assignment. You don't have to find the previous stories and read up on them to make sense out of my stories or enjoy them. I don't think so anyway.
I think
it's just a bonus.
Yeah, I think it's important where it's still an enjoyable read as a standalone story. But for those nuffies who do podcasts and for those who love their Phantom and stuff like that, having that ability to be able to go, oh, I remember that story. And that's one of the things I like about your work, and especially Shane Foley's work as well, where they're dripping so much in Lee Falk stories and Team Fantomen stories, where you're like a little kid. I remember as a kid, the Son of the Desert. I think that's around the 12th Phantom, maybe.
Yeah.
with Renita. The first story where they met has actually not been published by Frew, and I remember that reference reading Son of the Desert, where you're kind of reading it, and then it's like they're on their honeymoon, and then it says, "Oh yeah, when when this happened and this happened," and then there's a little not published by Frew, and I remember it was like, "Oh, what?" So there's my story of that as well.
Yeah.
Now in a lot of your stories, you tie together. Continue on with this, a lot of loose ends and clear up contradictions, especially with the Trucing Brotherhood. Is there a loose end or a contradiction that hasn't yet been tackled that you plan to fix?
Have a plan for it, but I do have a document, and it's not just compiled by me, but it's stuff that other fans have noticed as well, which are like open plot points, characters that disappear, even though it's mentioned that this is not the last we have seen of this and that character or stuff like that. So I have a list of that, and not just for me as a writer, but ideas for Team Fantomen in general for our production. So there are a few plot points like that, but at the moment I don't have any immediate plans to fix something like that. No.
A lot of the other guys from Team CC couldn't join us, but some of these questions are from them, and this is one of them. In the dailies, we have recently read those stories about the 21st Phantom's demise. Now, Tony DePaul wrote in his blog that he sees this as the end that readers should take away if or when the strip gets cancelled. In your role as a writer, but also as an editor, you probably didn't get any say in any of that. But if you did, would you follow this plan and let the current Phantom die and write about this and Savannah's possible children? And I know there's been one story that's already been created, Kit and Kat, which is about the Phantom in the 22nd Phantom Kit Jr. in the Himalayas. But do you have to then see that in the dailies and then bring that into your stories, like Heloise now being educated in Morristown at that school?
Well, first of all, I think that all of us who work on the Phantom accept that the newspaper strip is the main Phantom, and what the others do, the other publishers, is when they're producing licensed stories, we can't affect the newspaper strip. So we can do stuff. We have had a lot of freedom, and in the past it was even more freedom for Egmont and Fantomen to do their own thing, and it didn't have to be affecting the newspaper strip at all. But when the newspaper strip does something, we sort of have to take it into consideration a bit more. We can ignore it because, as I said, we can determine that these are different continuities and they don't have to play out exactly the same way. But when something happens in the newspaper strip, I think that we do try to look at it as something that we should try to incorporate. Like you said, Kit in the Himalayas and Heloise, her time in New York and stuff like that, has been incorporated into Team Fantomen stories. So we're not ignoring it in a way. And this recent things with the 21st Phantom's possible death and what would happen with the next generation and so on. I think these are interesting things. I don't think that we would be forced to follow them. We could continue doing stories about the 21st Phantom forever, or have a different type of ending for him. That's absolutely possible, I think. But then you would have to, the readers would know that these are different continuities and they don't coexist. They are different. And yeah, our version is basically all licensed stories are what if stories in one sense, even though, as I said, within our continuity, we have to take them very seriously. Within the Team Fantomen stories, we have to take them very seriously, even though fans of the newspaper strip stories are going to disregard them as what ifs.
Okay.
And I think it's an interesting concept that Tony has developed. I think that It's kind of like the X-Men also have like a dark future timeline where stuff has gone wrong, and they have done several storylines set in that future. And there could be down the line stories about Savarnas and the 21st Phantom children and how they developed the Phantom legend. But I think that if we had a production of stories today that was big enough to do a bit more experimental stuff, then I'm sure we will see it. But as it is now, when resources are limited, I think that all publishers are trying to focus more on like the actual Phantom stories, the actual current day Phantom, and so to speak. We will see less and less of the experiments, such as the Crusader Phantom and future Phantoms and all that. We will have less of that unless the production increases, the number of stories in total increases, then it gives space for experiments and different timelines and futuristic versions. So maybe someone will one day create stories about the adult children of Savarna and the Phantom and how they tackle the Phantom legend. It would be interesting to see. I don't know if I'm going to write any of that, but yeah.
All right, well, let's see if we can get a closure of Sandal Singh's child before we try and throw in other possible illegitimate or other possible children.
Yeah, good idea.
We're going to nail down in some of your stories. Now, I've got file copies of your stories. We're going to go through the Team Fantomen ones, then the Lightning Strikes, and then the Frew ones. Now, I've got them in colour and black and white. Colour ones are usually, obviously, in British. So if you are looking at it on YouTube and you can't understand it, it's not that your eyes are not working. It is actually in a different language. So I am going to go with Blood Rain first. Okay, so Blood Rain was drawn by Veludo, Bade, Savic, Boix, Lepanan, Pedrozzini, Spadera, and Ruse. Now, you made mention that Spadera has passed and Veludo hasn't done. I don't think he's actually done any Phantom stories since this one. It was first published in 2018 by Fantomen and Fantomet, which is Norway and Sweden, and Frew, it was published in 2019. Now, Frew published this in black and white, where, my opinion, it works and it's amazing where it's in color. Were you a little bit disappointed that Frew published it in black and white and not color?
No, it's actually, when I did it, we can go back to the origin of the story first of all.
Yeah.
Mikael Sol, who was editor at the time, he made a post on a comics forum in Sweden where he like casually mentioned that he enjoyed jam stories where several artists work on one story, and he would like to do one for the Phantom. But usually when American superhero comics do a jam story, it's also a lot of writers involved. So you have one writer and one artist doing 1 or 2 pages, and then they leave it over to another writer and an artist. So it's like they're like setting each other up. The writers are leaving, take this and do something with it. And it makes the whole story kind of fun, but it can also feel like disconnected. And, you know, the ending isn't what the first writer had in mind, if he even had an idea. So he wanted to do a jam story, but one writer, so the story is consistent from beginning to end. And he also wanted the switch ups between artists to make sense within the story. So it's not just, these jam stories, they can really be like switching from one style of art to another very abruptly, even if it's like in the same scene. And coincidentally, I already had one idea that had been in the back of my mind for a while about the 21st Phantom discovering that he has a lot of memory gaps, amnesia, and he doesn't know what has happened. And I thought that was an idea that could work as a jam story, because then every flashback would be another artist. And when you go back to the main storyline. It's a different artist again, so every switch between scenes sort of makes sense. And my idea, as I pitched it to Mika Sul, was actually that all the flashbacks should be in black and white, because the Swedish magazine was in black and white when I grew up, and then they turned it into a color magazine in the early 90s. So in my mind, there would be the flashbacks would be drawn by the artist that had been working on the Phantom the longest, and it would be in black and white. So then it would look like this is like a missing story from the 1980s.
Oh, yeah.
So that was my idea. But then I also came up with the concept of tying every flashback scene, every amnesia period to the blood rain phenomenon, to make like a cool effect or something. And he decided very smartly that this should be in color, because blood rain will look awesome in color, so we can't have the flashback scenes in black and white.
Yeah, for those who are on YouTube, you'll see it as we're flicking through.
Yeah, so I understood that point, but he still followed my idea that the artist that had been working the longest on the Phantom did the flashback scenes. So the first flashback scene is by Heiner Bade, who has been working on the Phantom since the 1970s, and the second flashback is by Kari Leppänen, and the third flashback is by Cesar Spadari. All those three artists worked on the Phantom during the black and white era of the Team Fantomen. So that was fun that it actually got done that way anyway. But then when Frew published the story in black and white, then I got to see it the way I intended it, but also the present day scenes were in black and white. So all that is missing now is that some publisher does it the way I intended it, with the present day scenes in color and the flashbacks in black and white, and then we will have my original intention. So for me, I thought it was fun to see both versions. I'm happy with the fact that Frew did it in black and white.
Yeah. So what we'll do, for those who are on YouTube and following along, you've just seen it in color, and I will just bring it up in black and white, and you can we'll quickly flick through that, because I'm sure there'll be some people that haven't seen either of them or one or the other. So this is it in black and white here.
Yeah, that's a black and white version. I think it looks great as well. And as I said,
it does, but that redness of the rain,
yeah,
which is very striking. Like in Australia, we've got a saying called "it sticks out like dog's balls," and I know that's probably a little bit crass for for the red, but it does. Like, you read it and it's like, whoa, this is so,
and that's also something that was added very late. I don't remember if it was during the scripting or if it was when I wrote the synopsis to Mikael. But my original idea was that the natural phenomenon to connect the amnesia periods with was supposed to be a blood moon, which is also something that you see sometimes, like the sky is dark and the moon is red, which was my first idea. And then somewhere along the way, I got to thinking about the blood rain phenomenon and thought that this is even more spectacular. And it was also easier. Then I sort of made the blood rain part of the story. The actual rain has an effect on the story. The rain makes the fires stop in the first flashback, and the rain actually affects the storyline, which a moon probably couldn't have done.
Yeah, no, I really enjoyed that story. So I'm assuming you are happy with the outcome of the story?
Very happy, and I got to be probably a bit more involved in the production of this story than a writer usually is, because you had to make sure that important things were part of the whole story. And it's more difficult for an artist when they're just doing 3 pages here to actually get everything in the panels that you have to have if it affects something like 10 pages later. So I was more involved than usual, and of course it was more work for Mikael to, recurring characters were drawn by one artist, and then it was shown that artwork to the other artists who were drawing the same character. It was a lot of extra work for him as well.
Yeah, like
But
you don't want it to have short hair drawn by one artist, and then the next artist who's drawing in present day has her in a big fro or something like that.
Exactly. And another thing that happened, the usual length of a Egmont Phantom story these days is 22 pages, and Mikael wanted me to write the script for 8 artists to draw. So 22 pages divided by 8 isn't equal, which means that two of these chapters were written for 2 pages. But then after the script was done, I think Mikael realized that that's not fair. So all artists were told that you can draw your section, your chapter, over 3 pages. But the script wasn't changed anything. So a couple of chapters in this story, they were written with the intention of having, not too many panels, so they would fit on 2 pages. But the artist was then told, you can do this over 3 pages, which is, for example, it gave Boix the space to do one big splash page of the Morristown University, which otherwise wouldn't have been done because that chapter was only intended for 2 pages.
So did you bill for the extra pages, or did you only get paid for?
I only got paid for the 22-page script. Yeah.
Okay, so the next story published by Team Fantomen is called The True Singh Brotherhood. Now, this was drawn by Janice Auden. It was first published by Fantomen in issue 25-26 in 2021 and by Frew late last year in issue 1948, which is in the year 2023. Now, in my opinion, this story gave a great indication that you would have, and I know you're not the writer now, but you would have been a great candidate for the ongoing 22nd Phantom saga, because you had Sala, you had Kaya, and her story hasn't been published by Frew before. Correct me if I'm...
True. As we talked about, it's one of those stories where the reader has to go, I haven't seen that one in my language yet.
So correct me if I'm wrong, but it was kind of like drawn in like the animated Batman style back in mid to late 90s?
Early 2000s, I think. But yes, it was a sort of an experiment. It's a short story. It's drawn in a different style. And I don't know if the feedback from the readers was so bad that they didn't want to do any more of it, or if it was just a budget thing that there wasn't any room to make short stories at the time. But I think that she made an impact, and to me, she did anyway as a character. And I hope that Frew will publish her origin story or her first story someday. But
so I was just going to say, so like, for instance, the first, 1 page, 2, 3, first 3 pages, it references, you've got, the issue here, then you've got, 2 issues being published here and stuff like that. So this is the referencing where you're tying up all the loose ends and stuff like that. So, and then you've got now I must admit, I don't remember this hidden female jungle patrol women.
Well, again, not published by Frew.
Okay.
So yeah. Well, if we go back to how this story started, by then I had written several scripts for Frew, not just Femme Fatale, but none of them had been published yet. And I had talked to Mikael Sol about that, and he jokingly said, "If you pitch me an idea, I will make sure that story is published before any of the Frew stories." More like a joke. And I often have ideas, bits and pieces here and there. I think that he even mentioned, do something for the fans, do some fan service thing, because you know a lot of stuff. And I had 2 ideas. One idea was about these female patrol women of the Jungle Patrol, because they have appeared in one story by Team Fantomen, and obviously, or apparently, that story has not been published by Frew yet. But they appeared in one story, and then they were sort of tucked away, hidden in the Misty Mountains. But according to Team Fantomen continuity, there is a team of about 30 women of the Jungle Patrol who are stationed in the Misty Mountains, but they have almost never been mentioned since then. So that was one thing. I had a story idea that was going to be called The Lost Patrol. And my idea was that we bring them together when they are gone. They have disappeared, so we have to investigate why they are no longer at their Misty Mountains station, and that also gives us time to tell the backstory of how that part of the patrol was created. But I didn't have anything more than that. And then I had another story idea, which was about Kaya Singh, who is a true pirate. She's a swashbuckling, modern day though, pirate who is out on the seas and hijacking ships and stuff like that. And when the Sandal Singh storyline developed with her turning the Singh Brotherhood into like a company, the Singh Corporation, and she became the president, I just thought that not all the Singh pirates will like this development. A lot of them should really think that we are like pirates. We don't hide and act like we are respectable people and presidents and politicians. So I brought her back to sort of represent that part of the Singh Brotherhood that must have hated her time as president and leader of the Singh Brotherhood. And when Mikael just asked me can you pitch one idea to me, it just clicked for me that these two ideas can be brought together as one. And the connection was the smuggling of radioactive material, which is discovered by the female Jungle Patrol and is being done by Kaya Singh. So that tied the two story ideas together. And after that, it wasn't easy. It took a long time for me to write the script, but that was also because Mikael commissioned me to do this story, and then he resigned from the editorship of Fantomen, and I was hired as new editor. So instead of writing the script, I was busy taking on a new job and everything that was part of that. So I was running really late. I was a terrible freelancer, a terrible writer, an editor's nightmare, because I didn't deliver on time and I just pushed it back and pushed it back. And finally, Jacob said, well, if you deliver it now, we can do this and it will become the 1000th Team Fantomen story. And I hadn't thought about that. I sort of in the back of my head, I knew that we were coming up to 1000, but I was so busy doing other things, while Jacob, he was also new at his job, so he was doing a lot of research, and he was sort of looking at the list, and he saw, well, the last issue of this year, if we have a new story in that issue, it will be the 1000th story from Team Fantomen. And by then I had missed so many deadlines that it was my story that was the next in line for that issue. So that motivated me to finish the script, of course. And it was just a matter of not having time to do it, because the actual scripting was really fun. As you said, it's filled with references, and a lot of this comes to me while I'm writing the story, because then I have characters talking to each other and reminding each other of past stories that would make sense for them to talk about in this situation. So that was fun. And again, I delivered a script for 22 pages. And when Jacob saw it, he said, this is going to be great, but we're going to give the artist a bit more pages to flesh it out on. So the final story is 26 pages.
Yeah, I was for 26 pages?
Paid for 22.
Cost saving. Well done,
yeah,
Jacob.
but the option would have been that I would have had to cut down on stuff, because the pages would have been it wouldn't have been any room for splash pages like this. Yeah, these two panels would have been two very small panels on a page. on a page with like 8 panels in total to make it work.
Mm.
So I have no problem with that. I mean, my job was to write a script for 22 pages, and I did it. And then he gave the artist, he hired the artist to flesh it out on 26 pages. So the artist did 26 pages worth of work, and I did 22. So that's fair.
Yeah, I was pausing on this page here. So this is page 12 if you're in the Phantom Man issue. If you're only listening to us on audio, it's the Phantom underneath the tunnel, underneath the Jungle Patrol. And this is one of those panels where in black and white, it looks amazing. And then in color, it looks equally just as amazing. And you get to see even more detail. But in black and white, you get a just as well mood. It's one of those examples where, you know, Janice's work looks so good in color and black and white, which is also, to be fair, which is a skill of your colorist as well.
Oh yeah, and I really wanted Janusz for this story because as this was becoming sort of an anniversary story or an anniversary issue where we could like promote it with press releases and do all sort of fun stuff, we also wanted an artist that represented the next 1,000 stories. So instead of having one of those artists that have already worked for decades on the Phantom, we instead chose, you know, the next generation's main artist, which is Janusz, and instead we set the stage for the upcoming stories that we are making.
Some of the panels here also when Janice's shows like the freaky nature of the Phantom in the shadows, scaring the bad guys. That's an old trope, but every fan loves that. So I think you really nailed that very well. So
and as I said, I have a lot of fun with dialogue. I know that some artists don't like it when the writer fills the page with a lot of dialogue because it's difficult for them to fit in the action. But I had so much fun imagining what these characters would say to each other if they met, like on the preceding page where the Phantom confronts the crewman from Kaya Singh's ship. And that pirate, he's scared to death of the Phantom because he has met him several times. But the Phantom doesn't remember him because he meets pirates all the time. So it was just fun for me to, you know, that's not something that is part of the synopsis. The synopsis is very limited, no dialogue, just the main plot points. So something like that, fun dialogue, is added when I'm writing the panel by panel script.
And then you bring back Sala.
Yeah.
So was that a bit of fun bringing back Sala?
Yes, it was a lot of fun, and but it's not something that I would have done if it hadn't been for the fact that she has already been brought back by Team Fantomen. So she was brought back in a storyline with Sandal Singh about 10 or maybe 15 years ago. And I just felt that storyline, that wasn't the last we have seen of Sala. So now when I'm crafting a story where we have Sandal Singh and we have other Singh pirates that don't like her leadership, it just became a very natural part for me that Sala also has problems with Sandal Singh. So it was just she didn't appear because I wanted to find a way to bring Sala back. It was because I was writing a story where it made sense for Sala to reappear.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So your third story you created is the one for Lightning Strikes, which is titled Final Chapter. We probably should have done this the last story, and then that could have kind of, but and this was drawn by Nick Roche, who you said that you actually have a relationship with. This was published. Now, a lot of fans probably don't actually have this issue. I believe you're one of those fans that don't actually have this issue in Lightning Strikes number 3, which was published in 2019. But then it has also been published in the Finnish and the Swedish noir trade paperback, which was also in 2019. So so if you so some fans have seen it. A lot of Australian fans have probably never ever seen this story because I know a lot of these comics didn't make their way into Australia. So what's the relationship with you and Nick?
Okay, so among many other things, I also run a publishing company for comic books and graphic novels, which I have done for just over 10 years now. And in 2017, maybe 2018, I published a Transformers graphic novel, a big hardcover book, where Nick was artist and writer. It's a really, really good story. If I have been a Transformers fan for almost as long as I have been a fan of the Phantom, and there are some really, really good Transformers comics. So we published this book to coincide with an event in Sweden called Retcon, which is a gathering for fans of Transformers. And I did the whole project. The book was in cooperation with one of the organizers from Retcon. So when we got the deal to make the book, we started to expand the idea. Well, what if we bring in Nick, who was the artist and writer of that story? So we invited him as a guest to the event. And then we also invited James Roberts, who was co-writer on this story together with Nick. So they both came to the release of the Transformers book in Sweden.
Oh, wow.
And it was a great, great time. They are so funny and nice people. And they are also fans who became professionals on the property that they love the most. They were Transformers fans in their youth. Nick is from Ireland. James is from Guernsey, an island outside Britain. And they were fans of Transformers who started to doing like fan fiction and convention stuff and all that. And then they got hired to work on the actual Transformers comic books for an American publisher. So they also crafted stories that were very deeply connected to previous. It was a different continuity, but it was noticeable that it was done by people who respected the characters and the storylines from the past. And yeah, it was a great experience, great fun. Nick is a great writer and artist. And we brought him back for one more event in Sweden, a Comic Con, a more general Comic Con for not just Transformers. Egmont had a booth there. I showed him around the Phantom stuff that I work on. I wasn't an editor by then, but I did some other stuff, freelance stuff for the Phantom. And somewhere along that time, Lightning Strikes announced that they were going to do more Phantom stories, and they would accept submissions for like one issue would be an anthology of short stories. I don't remember if it had already happened when we were in Stockholm face to face, or if I wrote to him about it later, but I just said, hey, the Phantom that I know so much about is being produced in Ireland, and an Irish publisher wants submissions of short stories. And I think that Nick even knew the people at Lightning Strikes. I mean, obviously, Ireland is a small comics fan world as well. So I made a pitch for a story, 2 pages, where the Phantom almost doesn't appear at all. Once again, it's a story where we meet people who are affected by the Phantom more than we see him. And for us who are fans, we already know about the Phantom, so we kind of figure out what he was doing in the story anyway. But it got accepted, and Nick did the artwork. And I also, at that time, was working on the Noir trade paperback, and I knew that we would have 2 pages to fill. And either we would have to fill them with like articles, text that I write, or we could try to get this story in the book, and that worked out actually. But in that book, it's in black and white.
Yeah, it's like the Phantom appears, as you said, if you're on YouTube here, twice, 2 panels. Yeah. But no, I enjoyed that whole comic. I enjoyed what Lightning Strikes did. It's a bit of a pity that people so far haven't seen a lot of the work. Hopefully with Lightning Strikes, I don't know, having the license back or whatever, we might get a lot of other fans might get to see it. But yeah, it must be pretty cool having your work published in Ireland as well as Australia, Norway, and Sweden.
Yeah, and as I said, it was really fun to work with Nick on this. There are a lot of small things, references that aren't Phantom references. That is just fun for me and Nick. There are a couple of Transformers references in the storyline instead. So that was fun to do. And I remember one thing that Lightning Strikes pointed out was that they wanted their character, the policewoman, McDowell, I think, to be in the story, which was absolutely fine by me. But I didn't know her. The stories with her hadn't been published yet. So the story is kind of a bit ambiguous on, does she know the Phantom? Does she believe in the Phantom? Does she know the Phantom secrets? Because I didn't know how that storyline would eventually play out in the other stories. So she doesn't really reveal if she knows about the Phantom or if she just thinks it's superstition. Yeah, or if she is actually a friend of the Phantom but hides it from the villain. And that doesn't. I didn't know when I was writing the story, so it's left ambiguous in the story.
I think it works well like that.
Yeah. Also, my title for the story was Safe Space. If you have read the story, it's about a villain who actually turns himself in to the police to hide from the Phantom, because he feels that's the only safe space he can go to in the end. He will always have the Phantom on his trail if he tries to escape justice. So eventually he just goes to prison voluntarily. When they published the story, they called it Final Chapter by Lightning Strikes, and I don't really know why, if that was because it was, last published story or whatever, but my story title was Safe Space, tying into that idea of the villain finally giving up.
Awesome. Okay, so moving on to the fourth story, which is the Femme Fatale, which we have talked about. This was the first one. This was your first story. You can go listen to the start of the podcast again. We won't go over that. This was drawn by Ivan Rodriguez. First published in Frew 1909, issue 1909, which was 2022, and it was published in Fantomen in issue 13 of the same year in 2022. So this was published fairly straight away. So you said that you'd written the script and then you kind of indicated that there was a little bit of a gap between it being drawn. Are you able to fill in a little bit more about that, or?
Well, the script was done in 2017 and the story was published by Frew in 2022. So that's a 5-year gap.
Yeah.
After many gaps along the way before that. So that's why I said I started writing the ideas down in 2006 and it was published in 2022. So it was a long period of creating this story. And I do know that several artists were assigned to draw this story, but for different reasons had to move on to other things. I think three artists that I know of were assigned to this story before Ivan Rodriguez finally did it. So that was probably a lot of where the time went. And that happens. I mean, that also happens with Egmont. I would say it's even tougher with Egmont because, like I said, we make stories designed for a specific issue, and we really, really want that deadline to be met to the point where we will actually replace an artist mid-story if they can't finish for health reasons or other reasons. Whereas Frew, they do work for a longer time on their stories, and it's okay for them that it takes a longer time. And then when the story is finished, then they schedule it for publication. So it's a different.
Which method do you prefer?
I think that Frew's version definitely gives more time for a story to find the right artist, to improve the artwork along the way. The script also can be adjusted a bit more along the way. I think that Team Fantomen worked a bit more like this in the past, like in the 70s, 80s, 90s, perhaps. But it's
with
a different
budget. Yeah,
bus-
with budget
yeah,
restraints.
it's a different, yeah. They don't have a budget to produce more stories than they're going to use, which means that if the story that is scheduled is produced on time, then you're going to have a gap. And either you can hope that another story is, that's why they are all the same length. So you theoretically you can replace them and publish them in a different order, but not always will there be a story that is ready on time.
So this was one that was originally drawn for black and white and then was colored by your Fantomen colorist.
Yep.
I believe that's correct.
Yes.
Now, are you able to tell us who the other three artists were, or is that something that you don't want to make mention on?
No, I think that's something for either the artist or Glenn Ford to share, because that also, as I said, a lot of things happened behind the scenes at Egmont also, which is never shown to the public, because all changes that are made before anything has been drawn will never be obvious.
Yeah.
So it happens also for Egmont that artists get switched around, and it can be for many different reasons. They can get sick, someone in their family can get sick, they can be offered a job that pays more, and you have to pay the bills. And
I
we
love
can.
this.
I mean,
love this page.
Yeah.
This is such
But
an amazing page.
one thing that happened in the process was I was asked by Glenn to make the page breaks in the script, because when you write a script, you can do it basically two ways. Either you just make a long list of panels and leave it up to the artist to decide how many panels to fit in one page and what makes sense for them to draw layout wise, or you can make page breaks and decide these 7 panels should be on one page, the next page should be 5 panels, the next page should be 8 panels. It's the writer can have an image in their mind about how it should look, and I write panel by panel with no opinion on how it's presented on the page by the artist. Sometimes I will give a hint like this panel would look great like a full page splash, or this page would look good bigger like a half page, or this panel would be a great way to end the page because then you have like a cliffhanger for the next page. But I don't usually do the page by page breakdowns. And this is, for Egmont, this is different for every writer. They can basically do it however they want to. And for Frew, I don't know if it's that way for Frew. I think, for example, Pidde Anderson, he writes page by page how he wants the panels to be. But he has also been an artist in the past. He has like an artistic view of the whole page, how it should be layouted. Whereas in my mind, the story is more like the frames of a movie. It's panel. I don't see an image of how the whole page should be layouted for best graphic impact. I leave that up to the artist. But Glenn asked me to do the page breakdowns for this story because that was what his artists were most used to. So in this case, I actually went back and I had to think, okay, where should I break down this page at this page? And that's I don't remember if I did that for the other Frew stories or if it was just this one, but it's definitely the first time that I tried to do it like that.
That was going to be my next question.
Yeah, the Egmont stories were not written that way. The Blood Rain story was, of course, written in chapters for each artist, but I never specified how many panels on each page.
Yes. All right. So the next story is The Links in the Chain. Now, this is a story where you reintroduce the characters. I can't remember their names. That were from the Cy Barry story, The Missing Link. If you're on YouTube, you will see some of the panels flowing by instead of our glorious faces. This was first published in issue 1932, which was published in 2022, and again by Ivan Rodriguez, and then it was published and colored by Fantomen in issue 12, 2023.
Yeah, and this is the only story where I was sort of told what to write about. All my other stories have been based on my original ideas from the beginning. But in this case, Frew was doing these series of stories that were sequels to old newspaper stories. So Glenford contacted me and he said, could you write a sequel to The Missing Link? And I thought, that's not a story that I would have thought about doing a sequel to.
Elaine and Claude.
Yeah. And I was about to say, no, I don't think I can come up with anything. But I had a trip to make, a car drive for a couple of hours. So I got the email from Glenn. I thought, this is not something I can do. Sat in the car for 2 hours. And when I got out of the car, I had the basic idea for the story. It had just been building in my head while I was driving. So that was fun. I didn't think that I could write stories on command like that, but this one turned out okay, I think.
Yeah, you use an old jungle saying in your story. On this podcast, we have made mention that every Phantom story needs to have at least one old jungle saying included in it. Otherwise, it's not a Phantom story.
Yeah.
So it's good to see you've filled your quota there.
And what made it come together for me was actually this story is based on smuggling, and specifically smuggling of trucks, which came to me first of all because of a joke. There is an old joke about a border guard who is, really good at catching smugglers. But there's this one guy that passes through a lot. He comes riding on his bike. He goes through the customs, and the customs guard goes looking through his stuff, and he doesn't find anything. But he's just sure by the way that this guy smirks that he is actually smuggling something. So finally, he asks the guy, "Okay, I'm not gonna charge you or anything, but you have to tell me what are you smuggling?" And the guy says, "I smuggle bicycles," because he walks out and he takes a bike on the way back. And that's the plot for this circus smuggling of stolen trucks. Is they use the touring of the circus to add stolen trucks so they can get through customs. And another thing was when these trucks, they are all from the same design, the same model, and then they are shipped to Africa. And what happens during the trip down to Africa is that they take those trucks that aren't perfect, they use them for spare parts and fix the trucks that are that need to be fixed, and then they just push the scrap over the ship's edge down to the sea. And this is actually based on a true thing that a friend of mine, it happened to him, that he had a car for sale. And suddenly a person calls up and says, "I'm going to buy that car. Don't you want to come see it? Don't you want to come try it?" "No, I'm going to buy it. I'll pay whatever you want." And then he came and picked it up. And my friend is, "Why do you really want this car? It's nothing special." But then he said that they are rounding up cars of the exact same model, exact same type, buying lots of them, putting them on a ship to Africa, doing an exact same thing that I said. They're fixing the ones that need fixing. They use the others for spare parts. That is actually something that is happening, and I just added it to my idea about the smuggling.
Yeah, interesting. I really love this page here by Ivan. The colors really do good as well. Like you got the kids. It's fun. It's vibrant. And one thing you will notice is Ivan does love a good old splash page.
Yeah.
Which don't we all? I love this splash page at the end. I don't think it really adds anything to the story or anything, but it looks cool. The last story that you have written, which you have said is your favorite story. Now, this story was actually published in color for Frew, but then you guys have actually recolored it for Fantomen. That's correct?
That's true.
So it was first published by Frew in issue 1952, which is in 2023. Now, those Fans who are pretty savvy would recognize that this is the story that was in the special issue, which is, I've actually got this one right here, which is this one here, the 75th anniversary. And the reason I got these out is because I will be sending you a copy to get signed. So yeah, so we'll go through the Frew colors first, and then we'll go through the Fantomen colors. And so those who, with the eager eyes, can kind of look through it. Again, you've got some splash pages. You've got Ivan Rodriguez drawing Julie Walker here. Now, there's a few little references in this story. The first one, which I will admit I did miss, is this one here, which you're not got. Most fans probably wouldn't recognize this, but this is the picture of Kit and Julie jumping off a ledge. And in a Frew story, it was done by Paul Ryan, I believe. So probably 15 years ago, maybe. You've actually got Kit doing the same jump off the same ledge. So that was a pretty cool little feature that you did.
Yeah, if you go back to that spread with them jumping off, the whole origin of this story is one panel in another story, and that's the panel which Ivan did a new version of down at the left page of that. It's a panel from a story called The Demon by Norman Worker and Jaime Valvé. And it's just one of those casual references to all the other stories that have happened in Phantom lore. So it's a panel of Julie and the 17th Phantom being confronted by a gang of Singh pirates while they are standing at the top of a tower in front of a sea, open waters. And that's it. There is no story that explained how that happened, and especially not how they got out of it. So that's what intrigued me. That was one of those open ends. What was that story about? When were Julie and Kit fighting Singh pirates, and how did they get up on that tower, and how did they get out? And the way out was, as you said, something that I saw in a story drawn by Paul Ryan, where he shows Kit and Heloise in present day playing around in the waters, jumping and having fun. And it just dawned on me that Julie and the 17th Phantom, they grew up in the same place. They must have been playing at the same places that Kit and Heloise. They must have practiced jumping off the same ledge, learning how to survive a jump from a high altitude down in the waters. So that solved the question, how do they get out of it? They just simply are really good at jumping into the water, like all other Phantoms probably are from growing up where they did. But then the question, how did they get there? And then I had to think back, the thing about Julie is that you have to find a reason for her to put on the Phantom costume and mask and act as the Phantom, which she usually does when her brother is not available. And in this case, slave raiders are going through the jungles, and she feels compelled to do something. So that
I love this page here of Julie and the Phantom fighting. One of the things that I thought you did really well in this story is you've actually done the 17th Phantom and Julie actually working well together as a team. In a lot of stories, when you've got two Phantoms, it almost feels forced, where this story wasn't forced. It's actually like, well, that makes sense. You have one Phantom fighting it, and then you have the other Phantom kind of working in the shadows and kind of like as a backup, and it works well. So I thought that was actually well done.
Yeah, and like I said, Julie doesn't act as the Phantom normally, so her brother has to be out of the picture at the beginning of the story. But I also had to bring them together to reach that panel where they are confronted by the pirates. And I think it worked out pretty well. And I had a lot of fun. Again, I supplied a lot of reference pictures, and not everything was Phantom related. I threw in some of the characters are drawn to look like actors and people like that, and it has no connection to the Phantom at all, but it was just fun stuff for me. Picked up some inspiration story-wise from that. But if you go to the preceding page, if you go back just a little bit, there, the Jungle Patrol men in the bottom right corner or on this entire page, they are inspired by Swedish actors.
Okay.
So that's why they're not for you Australians to recognize. The guy with the mustache is based on an actor and comedian named Hans Alfredsson, and he used to portray a character called Lindemann. So his character in this story is called Major Lindemann. That is something that maybe a handful of people in Sweden would recognize. And his acting partner or comedy partner, Tage Danielsson, is the inspiration for the Colonel in this story, but he never had a beard, so he's a bit more difficult to recognize. But I did send photo references of these actors to go along with my script.
And where we're talking about here, this is the reference to Kate Somerset.
Yeah, and again, that's just when you have Julie and the 17th Phantom talking about something that I have been through like this, it would just be natural for the 17th Phantom to think about his first true love, Kate Somerset. So in this case, I'm not creating a story so I can mention Kate Somerset, but I'm creating a story, and the Phantom would definitely think back to his days with her when everything has happened like this. To me, the 21 different Phantoms are different people with different experiences and different memories and different personalities. And in this case, the 17th Phantom, he had a very tumultuous love affair with a pirate woman, and that's going to affect him in every story.
Yeah,
even a story like this where he has a wife and he has a son, but he knows what it's like to lose a loved one also.
Yeah, and that was one of the things that I picked up doing the Phantom Bible, was seeing I was writing, and I was reading 10, 20, 30 stories about each Phantom at a time. So I was finding out all the stories that was featuring this Phantom and then reading all of them. I was actually picking up characteristics of each single Phantom. So for instance, like the 20th Phantom is more mollycoddle than compared to his son. And, then you've got the 13th Phantom, who's flamboyant, he's flashy, and you can really pick up the characteristics. Yeah, I think you raised a good point. Now, a couple of quick things. Ivan Rodriguez has drawn a lot of little things down here, which obviously are toys. Do they resemble any past Phantom stories, or are they just a bit of fun from Ivan?
I think that's all his. As I said, I supplied a lot of art references with my story, so he had a busy time doing the stuff that was fun for me. But I'm sure that he added those to just be fun for him. Well, you mentioned the 100. I had already in a previous conversation mentioned to you that I was inspired by that story, and I have met a lot of writers or corresponded with them and editors, so I know that all writers pick up inspiration from different places and sometimes more or less openly take one idea from a story that is something completely different and they retool it into a Phantom story, for example. So some of the stuff, if you have read a lot of or seen a lot of other fiction, you can recognize a scene in a Phantom story and understand, he probably picked up that one from that thing. Usually the writers, they hide it a little bit. They tweak it around several steps. So it's not, unless it's in a conversation like this, where they actually reveal that the inspiration for that scene actually came from that TV series and something like that. But in this case, there was a TV series called The 100, a science fiction TV series. And this scene where Julie tries to help a captured slave girl, but instead that gets her caught, and then they sit in a prison cell together confiding in each other until we learn that this slave girl is actually the leader of the whole slave operation. That's a pretty open reference to the 100, where there is a scene pretty similar to this, actually. So I didn't even bother hiding it. If you are a fan of the 100, you must have recognized it. And in that case, I hope you see it as a tribute, because that was how it was intended. I really liked that show. I think, well, another thing is I said that I often write a lot of dialogue, but I make it difficult for the artist and the editors to fit in the text in the panels. But I also say to, especially to the Frew editors, that it's absolutely fine if you cut down the text. That's, the editor's job. I do that when I'm the editor of stuff that other people write. But in this case, I think they actually cut out the name of her. I can't remember seeing her name in the Frew story. So that's something that I made sure that her name appeared in the Fantomen version, so people will know that her name is Elissa, and that is just a tweaked version of Alicia, which was the name of the actress who portrayed the character on the 100 that did the same thing, and she's from Australia, actually.
Yes.
So it's an Australian reference. I did meet one of the actresses from the 100, but the actress that portrayed the infiltrating character, her name was Alicia Debnam Carey. Both of them are from Australia, actually. There were lots of Australian actors in this TV series.
Probably my last question on this story is, why did you recolor it? Were you not happy with the Frew colors, or?
Briefly talked to Jacob about it, but we both agreed that by coloring it by our regular coloring studio, it would feel like more of a part of our magazine. Yep. All other stories are basically colored by the same coloring studio. The exception is the newspaper strip stories. Yep. So by coloring it in the same way that we color everything else, it makes it feel like it's, again, part of a bigger whole. I think for Frew, it doesn't really matter as much, as very few stories are published in color. So if you have different colorists for every story, it doesn't really matter, because you only have a handful of stories that are published in color. Yeah. But in our case, by doing it with the same regular coloring team, it feels like it's just one other story. Yeah, it feels more consistent.
Awesome. Yeah, really enjoyed that. Really appreciate it. So you said that you've got one more story that you have written that is being drawn or will be drawn in the near future?
I don't know the status of that story, but a script was written for Frew quite a long time ago, so it's in their hands. And I also have a short story for Egmont this year.
Okay.
So there will be, hopefully, again, things can happen, but there will hopefully be a really short story by me during this year in Fantomen.
Awesome. Well, look, appreciate your time. Is there anything that we haven't talked about, or a question I haven't asked that you're itching to let us know? Like, for instance, who the new writer is for the 22nd Phantom storyline?
No, I'm not going to reveal anything about that. Now, something that came to mind during talking about this is, as I said, I like to write stories about characters other than the Phantom. Like in the Femme Fatale story, the Phantom is the story is really about Nika and her group of small-time crooks, and the Phantom just comes in and disrupts their plans, and he doesn't know them, he doesn't know what he's causing for her, and stuff like that. My inspiration is reading a lot of comics which are what they call team books, like X-Men and Transformers, as I mentioned, and some Star Wars comics where it's about a team of characters rather than one main character. I don't think that we should do that with every Phantom story, but I think it's fun to do that once in a while. And as I said, that's because in my mind, the Phantom is a comic not just about one person, but about a whole group of characters, good and bad, and historical and present, and all that. So it just makes it interesting for me that every character they're a main character in their own story. They're not just supporting characters in a Phantom story. So even the people that the Phantom meet, whether it's villains or friends, they all have separate lives outside the Phantom story, where like they are the main character, and occasionally they meet the Phantom and collide in a story with him.
Yeah. Yeah, and you can see that with Elaine and Claude in the Missing Link story, where they've in Europe somewhere,
Yeah,
and stuff like that. You've got yeah. So no, I think you see that. I appreciate it. That's one of the things that I enjoy about what Tony DePaul does with his daily stories as well. He's really developed, like, I don't like the change of it, but he's made Old Man Moz a more rounded, an actual character. Bubadon, he's introduced that, Garan with, so you've got a lot of these other characters that are actually characters in their own.
Yeah, you can feel that they do stuff between the Phantom stories. They're not just showing up in a Phantom story and nothing has happened in their life, but they actually have a life outside what we see in a Phantom story. And in the stories that I write, I give them a little bit more space to show their life, and then bring in the Phantom more as he is crossing through their story, so to speak, in several of my stories at least.
Yeah.
And
yeah, no, I like that. I've liked how other artists, other creators do it as well. So, yeah, and that's why I said I would have thought you would have been the logical choice for the 22nd Phantom Saga, but you've decided to go elsewhere. So look, I hope you fans have enjoyed that. Now, we did skirt around a few Team Fantomen editorial decision topics, but we are looking at doing another podcast in probably, I would assume, probably in the next month, inside the next month, where we will ask some more specific questions about Team Fantomen 2024 and beyond. We do try and do them every year, so that way fans can kind of know what's going on, and talk, and we can ask questions about the publishing and new creators and all that type of stuff as well. So look forward to chatting with you then, Andreas. Always a pleasure to talk to you. Now, thank you, fans, for listening to us or watching us if you're on YouTube. Our website is chroniclechamber.com, and our email is chroniclechamber@gmail.com. We'd love to hear your thoughts, feedback, and opinions. You can do that on our social media platforms, or you can jump over onto our YouTube channel and drop some comments. If there are questions that we haven't asked, or that you want to see Andreas as well, drop them in either in the social media or YouTube, and we will get some questions from Andreas and ask him who the 22nd Phantom writer is, and see if he might answer you instead of us. You can subscribe to us via YouTube or through your favorite podcast apps, including iTunes or Spotify. Thank you, fans. Thank you. Please get in touch with us, and as always, happy Phantoming. You can say happy Phantoming as well.
Happy Phantoming.